A $40,000 solid gold Rolex Daytona arcs through the tense air of the courtroom, its polished surface catching the harsh fluorescent lights like a strobe. It spins in agonizing slow motion, hurled with the full, unchecked fury of a young man who has never been told the word no. The gallery erupts in a collective, breathless gasp. Two armed bailiffs surge forward, boots pounding against the hardwood floor, but they are too late. The heavy timepiece strikes the edge of the judge's mahogany bench with a sickening, violent crack, a sound that shatters the manufactured invincibility of a political dynasty. It bounces, skids, and comes to a dead stop mere inches from the gavel of America's most unrelenting television judge. The cameras capture every micro-expression. The room falls into a deafening, paralyzed silence. Julian Vance, the 23-year-old heir to a 4-term United States senator, stands with his chest heaving, his tailored suit rumpled, having just committed the ultimate act of self-destruction. He didn't throw the watch out of mere disrespect. He threw it because, for the very first time in his pampered, insulated existence, his family's boundless wealth and political terror tactics had completely failed him. Judge Judy didn't just rule against him, she systematically dismantled the corrupt machine his father had built to protect him. But to understand how this single, viral courtroom outburst obliterated a massive re-election campaign and ended the Vance political bloodline forever, we have to rewind. We have to go back to a freezing Tuesday night in November, and a 62-year-old retired firefighter named Arthur Pendelton. Arthur wasn't looking for a fight. He was just trying to pay for his wife's chemotherapy. Julian Vance was 23, floating through life on a platinum credit card tied to his father's consulting firm. He drove a custom Aston Martin, wore shoes that cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, and viewed ordinary working-class people not as human beings, but as disposable props. Arthur was driving a rideshare to make ends meet, a humble hustle to keep the crushing weight of medical debt at bay. He had spent 30 years running into burning buildings to save strangers, earning every single gray hair. Julian had spent his life running from consequences, leaving a trail of shattered non-disclosure agreements in his wake. When Julian Vance stepped into Arthur's car that night, heavily intoxicated and radiating arrogant contempt, two entirely different Americas collided, and only one of them would survive the impending courtroom fallout. The 24-year-old product of the Vance political machine did not know Arthur Pendelton. He did not know about the mounting stack of hospital bills sitting on Arthur's kitchen counter, nor did he care. Julian only knew that the ride was taking too long, the music wasn't what he wanted, and the driver wasn't displaying the required level of absolute deference. From the back seat of the modest sedan, Julian began barking orders, his slurred voice thick with the kind of entitlement that is bred into a person, not learned. When Arthur, maintaining his steady composure, as he had during 3 decades of high-pressure emergency responses, politely asked Julian to lower his voice, the young heir snapped. It happened in the span of 30 terrifying seconds. Julian leaned forward, grabbed Arthur by the shoulder, and began violently shaking the older man. When Arthur immediately pulled over to the side of the dark road to stop the assault, Julian escalated. He punched Arthur in the side of the head, a cowardly, drunken blow that caught the retired firefighter completely off guard. But the physical assault wasn't even the most devastating part of the encounter. As Arthur scrambled to exit the vehicle and call for help, Julian snatched Arthur's phone from the dashboard mount. It wasn't an accident. He looked at the device, looked directly at Arthur, and intentionally hurled the phone into the street, shattering it into a dozen pieces against the concrete. That phone was Arthur's lifeline. It wasn't just how he earned his living. It held the only saved voicemails from his daughter, who had passed away 5 years prior. It held the last photos of his wife from before the aggressive chemotherapy stole her hair and her energy. Julian Vance didn't just break a piece of glass and plastic. He destroyed an old man's irreplaceable connection to his family. And as Arthur stood on the freezing sidewalk, bleeding from the ear and staring at his ruined phone, Julian simply hailed another premium ride from his own device and left, casually tossing a crumpled $50 bill onto the ground like it absolved him of the violence. By sunrise, the Vance family's notorious cleanup crew had already been deployed. This wasn't their first rodeo. The senator's designated fixer, a ruthless corporate attorney named Robert Sterling, arrived at Arthur's modest home before the police report had even been fully processed in the system. Sterling didn't offer apologies. He offered intimidation wrapped tightly in a $15,000 settlement. He made it implicitly clear that the Vance family had the power to make the assault charges disappear entirely and the absolute power to make Arthur's life infinitely more difficult if he refused the cash. Arthur, exhausted, terrified for his sick wife's health, and deeply intimidated by the sheer weight of the senator's influence, almost signed the non-disclosure agreement right then and there. But Arthur Pendelton was a firefighter. He had spent his entire adult life running toward danger, not away from it. When he looked at the shattered remains of his phone and remembered his daughter's stolen voice, something inside of him hardened into steel. He flatly refused the settlement. He refused to be silenced. And when the local police department, heavily pressured by the senator's office, dragged their feet on pursuing the assault charges, Arthur took the only path left available to him. He filed a civil suit in small claims court, seeking damages for the phone, medical bills, and lost wages. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate plea for justice was about to land directly on the desk of a television judge who had spent the last month quietly building a massive, career-ending dossier on the Vance family's corrupt empire. Julian Vance strutted into Judge Judy's courtroom on a Tuesday morning, emanating an aura of profound boredom. He wore a navy blue Brioni suit that cost more than Arthur Pendelton earned in 3 months of driving, paired with Italian leather loafers that had never seen the grime of a subway grate. Strapped to his wrist was the $40,000 solid gold Rolex Daytona, a gift from his father to celebrate his graduation from a university he had barely attended. Julian did not look at Arthur when he passed his table. He did not acknowledge the gallery. He didn't even bother to look up at Judge Judy when she entered the room. He simply slouched into his chair, pulled out his latest smartphone, and began scrolling with the casual indifference of someone waiting for a slow elevator. His attorney, a high-priced corporate litigator named Richard Crane, who normally handled multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions, leaned over and urgently whispered for Julian to put the device away. Julian ignored him entirely. Then, loud enough for every highly sensitive microphone in the courtroom to capture with crystal clarity, Julian glanced up at the bench and sighed. "How much longer is this going to take? I have a tea time at 3. The words landed in the silent courtroom like heavy stones dropped into a still pond. Judge Judy heard every single syllable. Her expression didn't change, but her hand moved deliberately to a thick, manila folder resting on the corner of her desk. She pulled it slightly closer, within easy reach. Anyone who had watched her program for more than 5 minutes knew exactly what that subtle gesture meant. The trap had been meticulously set, and Julian Vance had just blindly strolled into it, wearing a $40,000 watch he was about to lose. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with the kind of measured, icy calm she reserved specifically for individuals she had already decided to publicly destroy. She reviewed the basic facts of the case aloud, her voice crisp and deliberate, establishing for the permanent record that Arthur Pendelton was suing Julian Vance for the destruction of a mobile phone and medical expenses resulting from an assault. She then asked Julian to state his version of the events. Julian slouched deeper into his seat, checked the gleaming Rolex on his wrist for the 3rd time in 2 minutes, and delivered his account with the enthusiasm of a teenager reading a parking ticket. "The driver was being aggressive," Julian stated, rolling his eyes. "He got in my face. I pushed him back. The phone thing was an accident. It fell. My family already offered to cover the cost of a new one, but he wants to make a big scene to extort us." His attorney, Richard Crane, physically winced, clearly trying to mentally calculate the damage his arrogant client was inflicting upon himself with every careless word. Judge Judy watched this performance with the infinite patience of a predator observing a particularly clueless prey. She let him finish his dismissive narrative. She let the silence settle heavily in the room. And then she turned her full attention to Arthur Pendelton. Arthur Pendelton stood before the court, his posture rigid and respectable, hands resting calmly on the wooden podium. When he spoke, his voice lacked the practiced, polished cadence of a trial lawyer. Instead, it carried the undeniable, ragged edge of a man who had worked with his hands for 30 years and watched the love of his life battle a relentless illness. He didn't embellish. He didn't perform for the cameras or the gallery. He simply laid out the unvarnished facts of that freezing November night. He recounted the slurred, belligerent insults, the sudden, violent physical assault while he was operating a moving vehicle, and the intentional destruction of his personal property. But the temperature in the room dropped significantly when Arthur described the specific contents of that shattered phone. The gallery sat in absolute, breathless silence, as this hardened former firefighter's voice cracked for the first and only time. He detailed the irreplaceable voicemails from his deceased daughter, the sound of her wishing him a happy birthday, laughing at an inside joke, and the digital photos of his wife from before the chemotherapy stole her vitality. "I can buy a new phone," Arthur said, his eyes fixed steadily on Judge Judy. "But he took something from me that no amount of money can replace. And he did it just because he could." Julian Vance didn't look down in shame. He didn't offer a contrite apology. Instead, he let out a short, dismissive snort of laughter. It wasn't a loud guffaw, but in the pin-drop silence of that tense courtroom, it echoed like a cannon blast. He leaned toward his terrified attorney, Richard Crane, and whispered loudly enough for the sensitive courtroom microphones to catch every single syllable. "Are we seriously supposed to care about his sob story? This is a joke." Judge Judy removed her reading glasses with a slow, deliberate motion that made everyone in the room instinctively hold their breath. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register that regular viewers knew was the ultimate sign of impending doom. "Do you find this amusing?" Julian, completely insulated by a lifetime of bought and paid for impunity, actually scoffed. "I find it a waste of my time, Your Honor. My father's team offered him a more than generous settlement. He's just looking for a payout on TV." The trap had finally been sprung. Judge Judy's eyes locked onto Julian with the unwavering intensity of an apex predator. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reached for the thick manila folder she had kept close by since the proceedings began. "Your father's team," she repeated, tasting the arrogant words. "You mean Robert Sterling? Let's talk about Robert Sterling. And while we're at it, let's talk about the specific accounts Mr. Sterling uses to fund these generous settlements of yours." As she opened the file, the blood completely drained from Richard Crane's face, and Julian Vance's invincible smirk began to slowly, finally fade. Judge Judy did not even look at the file as she opened it. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly what was inside. Her eyes, sharp and unforgiving, were locked onto Julian Vance's face, a face that had spent 23 years never having to account for a single mistake. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice a calm, dangerous hum. "You keep mentioning your father's team. You keep mentioning settlements, as if they are simply the cost of doing business. But in this courtroom, we don't settle justice. We uncover the truth." She pulled a single document from the folder, a copy of a police report from 18 months prior regarding a hit-and-run incident involving a high-end luxury vehicle registered to a shell company in Delaware. This incident, Judy noted, her voice rising in pitch, was cleared within 4 hours. The witness, a student named Sarah, was visited by your legal team and signed an agreement that made her disappear. Do you remember this, Julian? Or were you too busy checking your tea time to recall the life you almost ended? Julian finally looked up, his smug expression flickering for a fraction of a second. The gallery went dead quiet. For the first time, he realized that the judge hadn't just done a Google search. She had done the work that the local police, under immense political pressure, had been forced to abandon. She had the bank records. She had the sworn affidavits. She had the digital footprint that the senator's high-priced fixers had been too arrogant to completely scrub. "I don't know what you're talking about," Julian stammered. Though his voice lacked its usual bite, he shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward Richard Crane. But Crane was no longer looking at his client. He was staring at his own tablet, his face ghostly pale as he realized the sheer scale of the evidence being laid out on the record. He knew, as any competent lawyer would, that a civil small claims case had just mutated into a massive, irreversible liability. Judge Judy didn't let him off the hook. She continued. "You think because your father sits in a state house, or because you can throw thousands of dollars at a broken phone, that you are exempt from being a decent human being. You are not. In this room, you are just a young man who broke a promise to a stranger and a piece of property belonging to a man who has worked harder in his sleep than you have in your entire privileged existence." The moral weight of her words felt physical, pressing down on the shoulders of everyone in the room. Julian Vance, the boy who thought he was untouchable, was suddenly, for the very first time in his life, looking at the harsh, unyielding reflection of his own character, and he clearly didn't like what he saw. Judge Judy didn't just lean forward. She practically vibrated with a controlled, lethal intensity. She didn't need to look at her notes. She had the entire financial roadmap of the Vance family's corruption memorized. "Mr. Crane, before you attempt to object again, understand this. I have the wire transfer records from Brighter Associates, she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a razor. This isn't a misunderstanding or a private settlement. This is evidence of a systematic, multi-year scheme to use campaign donor funds money given by honest, hard-working citizens to bury the tracks of your client's violent behavior. That, sir, is a federal crime. The courtroom felt as if the air had been vacuumed out of it. Julian's attorney, Richard Crane, turned a shade of gray that suggested he was moments away from fainting. The gallery, previously filled with bored observers, was now leaning in, recording devices held high, as the realization hit them. This wasn't just a petty dispute over a smashed phone anymore. It was the implosion of a political dynasty. Let's be very clear about what happened here, Julian, Judy continued, her eyes locked onto the young man's terrified face. You assaulted a man who was working 2 jobs to support his sick wife. You didn't just destroy his phone. You tried to destroy his dignity. And then you used your father's influence and stolen campaign money to try and buy his silence. You thought that money made you untouchable. You thought that as long as you had a checkbook, the laws of this country didn't apply to the Vance name. She pulled one last document from the folder, a sworn statement from a former campaign finance coordinator. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. I have here the testimony of David Chen, who served as your father's finance coordinator for 3 years. He details exactly how the senator authorized these consulting payments to cover the hush money for your various outbursts. He calls you collateral damage. That's how your own family views you, Julian. You aren't a son to be loved. You're a liability that they've been paying to keep quiet. Julian looked like he had been physically struck. His bravado, his entitlement, and his entire worldview were collapsing in real time under the weight of the truth. He tried to speak, to blurt out a protest or a threat, but his voice failed him. For the first time, the reality of his situation had fully breached his bubble of privilege. He wasn't the powerful heir to a Senate seat anymore. He was just a small, scared young man in a cheap suit, trapped in a room with a woman who held his entire future in her hands, and she was only just getting started. Judge Judy didn't look at the lawyers. She didn't look at the camera operators or the gallery. She looked directly at Julian, who was no longer checking his watch, but rather staring at the floor, as if trying to shrink away from the scrutiny of the room. "Mr. Vance," she stated, her voice an icy, controlled hum. "You seem to believe that your father's position in the Senate makes you immune to the laws that govern everyone else. You think because you can buy your way out of a standard charge, you can buy your way out of the basic human decency required to treat a fellow citizen with respect." She slammed her hand on the bench, not in anger, but to punctuate the absolute finality of her ruling. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Arthur Pendelton. I am awarding the maximum damages allowed in this jurisdiction, $25,000. And make no mistake, this isn't just about the phone. This is about the total lack of remorse you displayed for the pain you caused a man who has served this country for decades." She then turned her gaze toward the cameras, her expression hardening. "Furthermore, the evidence presented today regarding Brighter Associates and the suspicious flow of campaign funds to silence victims is being referred to the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Justice for an immediate, full-scale investigation. If you think this is over, you are sorely mistaken." The courtroom exploded, not with cheers, but with a frantic, buzzing energy. Richard Crane was already packing his briefcase, his hands visibly trembling as he processed the professional suicide he had just witnessed. Julian Vance sat motionless, his face pale and slack, finally realizing that no amount of money could silence the record Judge Judy had just created. Outside the courthouse, the fallout was instantaneous. By the time they reached the lobby, the news had already broken. The senator's office released a pathetic, stammering statement, calling the proceedings an entertainment spectacle, but it was too little, too late. The dam had broken. Within an hour of the episode airing, the scandal dominated every major network. By sunset, the affidavit, the one Judge Judy read aloud, was the front-page story on every newspaper from Washington to the state capitol. The senator, who had been cruising toward re-election, saw his double-digit lead evaporate in the span of a single news cycle. His party, terrified of the toxic association, pulled their funding immediately. 6 weeks before the election, the dynasty that had held the seat for 20 years was over. The senator withdrew, leaving a vacuum that would be filled by a local schoolteacher, a man who had never accepted a dime of lobbyist money. Julian Vance was eventually charged with felony assault, facing a real legal system that, for the first time in his life, did not accept his father's checkbook as payment for his crimes. Justice, for once, was not a theory, it was a definitive fact. The gavel strike did more than just settle a civil suit. It shattered the silence that had protected the Vance family for decades. Within 1 hour of the episode airing, the senator's campaign headquarters was besieged by reporters. By sunset, 3 major national news networks were running the story, and by midnight, the damning affidavit, the very document Judge Judy read aloud, was the lead headline in every major newspaper across the country. The senator, once cruising toward a landslide victory, saw his double-digit lead evaporate in the span of a single news cycle. His party, realizing that their reputation was now inextricably linked to his son's televised humiliation, pressured him to withdraw. 6 weeks before the election, the Vance dynasty was dead. The seat they had held for 2 decades was lost, eventually won by a former public school teacher running on a platform of total transparency and accountability. For Julian Vance, the fall was even more brutal. The non-disclosure agreements that had shielded him for years were effectively voided in the court of public opinion. Previous victims, seeing that the system finally had teeth, came forward in droves. His trust fund was frozen pending an investigation into campaign finance fraud, and for the first time in his 23 years, he was forced to navigate the legal system without the comfort of his father's checkbook or the protection of high-priced lawyers. He faced criminal charges, and for the first time in his life, "I don't know who my father is," wasn't a threat, it was a reality he had to live with. Arthur Pendelton, however, found his life transformed in ways he never imagined. The story of his struggle and his integrity went viral, touching the hearts of millions. A crowdfunding campaign raised over $300,000, ensuring his wife's medical expenses were covered for years to come. Data recovery experts, moved by his story, managed to restore the voicemails from his daughter, and his wife's saved messages, a small, digital miracle that meant more to him than any amount of money. This brings us to the ultimate lesson. Power, in its purest form, is only a shield as long as the public allows it to be. When the curtain is pulled back, when the truth is presented without the filters of wealth or influence, character is all that remains. Julian Vance learned that his name was just a word, and his money was just paper. But Arthur Pendelton? He proved that dignity is not something you are given, it is something you build, one honest day at a time. If you believe that no one should be above the law, then let this case be your reminder. Justice does not have a price tag, but privilege has an expiration date. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss the moment justice catches up with those who think they are untouchable. And if you have ever been told to stay quiet, let Arthur remind you that your voice matters. It always has. Thank you for watching.